watch will see is just sort of a heads up for you as an introduction to you of the federal oil spill program, the federal SPCC program. And again, another question, and I asked this before too, how many of you guys feel like you are fairly familiar and you've worked with, to some extent, the 40 CFR 112 SPCC rule? You've gone through it a couple of times, right? Here's what SPCC plans are good for or used for, right? Now, for the rest of you, how many guys have really never read through the federal regs before for SPCC plans? You could look, it's APSA class, right? Be proud. I've never read it, and I'm more awake for it, right? Yeah, look, that happens, right? Or how many guys have never really read through or seen an SPCC plan? Okay, a lot of folks. You have to keep part of understanding what's in an SPCC plan and what the intent of an SPCC plan. You need to understand there is a significant difference in how how EPA regulates the environment and protects the environment than how California regulates and protects the environment. It is different. And I'm not saying one's better than the other, but it's different, and the differences are important. Does EPA, as a quick example, does EPA's Clean Water Act, not EPA's Clean Water Act, does the Federal Clean Water Act prohibit or regulate injecting full-on hazardous waste into the groundwater? No. Says not one word about it. Under the Federal Clean Water Act, there is no prohibition or other regulation for injecting lethal, deadly, toxic, hazardous waste into groundwater, including drinking water sources. How can that be? There's another federal act that does that, the Federal Drinking Water Act, that regulates that, and in part, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, Federal Hazardous Waste Regulations with regard to permitting certain disposal activities. But it's not the Clean Water Act, right? Does the Federal Clean Water Act regulate groundwater? No, it does not. That's the Federal Drinking Water Act. It does not regulate groundwater. Likewise, does the Clean Water Act regulate subsurface soils? It does not. It regulates waters of the United States. Primarily surface waters, inland waters, rivers, lakes, streams, navigable waters, shorelines. That's pretty much the regulatory capture. So in terms of oil spill prevention, under the federal SPCC rule, 40 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 112, which is authorized by the Clean Water Act, what is the primary environment that is being protected here under these regulations? Specifically, waters of the United States, which are navigable water. We'll talk a little bit about the definition. Navigable waters, basically surface waters, oceans, 3 miles and in, lakes, streams, rivers, creeks, dry creeks, ephemeral streams, certain non-isolated wetlands, but not groundwaters, not soils, unless it's the shoreline soils or riverbank soils. That's not what's captured under this. So in terms of oil spills, preventing oil spills, containing spills, or containing discharges, what is EPA really trying to prevent here under the federal SPCC rule, 40 CFR 112? Discharges of oil to navigable waterways or to waters of the United States. That's the big protection here. So when there's a spill and it soaks into the ground, contaminating the groundwater, is that for the most part an SPCC regulatory issue and therefore an APSA statutory issue? No, it is not. Now, is it an other compliance issue with some of the other programs you have authority over? Well, of course it is. Right? Just discharges of what could be a hazardous waste, discharges to waters of the state under the California Water Code, other hazardous material requirements, perhaps fire code requirements. There may be issues in other parts of other codes and statutes and and regulations that your agency has authority over or jurisdiction for, but it may not be an APSA issue. You need to be able to separate that. A lot of things that are provided for or allowed under the federal SPCC rule sometimes don't make sense to us in the California regulatory world because we're not used to, well, what do you mean they can just have an unlined secondary containment? If it leaks, it's going into the dirt. Well, under APSA and SPCC regs, that could be okay because it's keeping it out of the navigable water. Well, but wouldn't that be a release of hazardous waste? It very well could be. But that's a hazardous waste regulatory issue. You know? Or, well, everything drains to, you know, their stormwater system, it drains to just this infiltration area out at the back corner of the facility. And they just let everything sit and soak into the ground and it'll recharge the groundwater basin. And, you know, that's what they do. Nothing gets out to the municipal system. And you're telling me that they can use that system as their secondary containment for their petroleum tanks? Yeah. Because it's not getting to navigable waters. How can that be? It's a different regulatory program. So you have to be able to kind of think about that. There are provisions that are not coordinated with other regulations, and that's just how the regulatory ball bounces, and we see that in a lot of other areas. And again, we'll go through and explain that, but that's part of how you need to start thinking in this program. And that's part of the reason why to California APSA inspectors, well, APSA inspectors here and you CUPA folks, that doing APSA inspections may be somewhat dissatisfying because there may be issues that you don't like, there may be issues that you don't agree with that aren't necessarily a regulatory violation or statutory violation. Maybe in other programs, but not under APSA or SPCC. So this is the stuff that we're going to hit. Just we're going to talk more about the federal history here because the history under the federal SPCC rule tends to be much more important because we're in a state of flux now in the regulatory program. And again, for those folks who are thinking, God, he keeps talking about the federal regs. Remember, 25270.4.5a, prepare and implement an SPCC plan in accordance with 40 CFR 112. So we're talking about 40 CFR 112. But you have to remember, and this is a nuance, but you have to remember, you are not enforcing federal rules. You are not enforcing federal law. You are enforcing state statute. You're using federal regulations to determine if somebody's in compliance or not with the state statute. There are some interpretations. You're going to be using federal interpretations, federal supporting documentation, federal guidance. That's fine. But you're using it to make a California statutory compliance determination is what you're doing. That, and I'm sure you recognize that and you realize that, but it changes how you document on an inspection report. You know, you're not citing, you know, somebody didn't have, you know, their valve was open and they're violating 40 CFR 112.8B2, and it kills me that I remember that. You know, there may be a compliance issue with 25270.4.5a in that the valve in the secondary containment was left open. Reference 40 CFR 112.8B2 or whatever it is, right? You're essentially saying sort of the same thing, providing a little bit more guidance, but again, you're citing state statute, not the federal rule. There may be stuff that, you know, their vegetable oil tank at the facility is spouting vegetable oil like the Trevi fountain in Rome, and it's squirting right into the storm drain, and you have this, and you get the vegetable oil just gooing out all over the river, right? Is that an APSA compliance issue? No. Why not? It's not petroleum, right? Are there other state regs or statutes that may kick in? Yeah, probably, but it's not APSA, right? So it's like, all right, well, I'll get to that directly, you know. But it's not necessarily, it's not an APSA issue. So, you know, just kind of keep that in mind. All right, so let's talk a little bit about. And I have a video of the tank car getting sucked in like that. I'll find it at a break. Yeah, it is pretty cool. It happens, bam, just like that. Just sucked it right in. It's pretty cool. Anyway, and I'm sure they blew it right back up and gave it back to the railroad. And okay, here now, go ahead Go ahead and put your lethal, deadly, toxic material in it and roll it up and down the rails. Yeah, that's just fine. You may want to paint over some of the cracks in there. Go get some tank car spackle from Lowe's or something and take care of that. Yeah, just leave it on the siding for 20 years. And yeah. All right. Now, the SPCC plan primarily, and again, a lot of regulated folks misinterpret this or don't understand this, as do some agency folks. An SPCC plan is primarily a protective, preventative, or preventive document in that it is similar to CalARP and RMP in that those are primarily engineering-based prevention documents and prevention-based programs. Same with the federal SPCC program. It is a prevention-based program. Yes, there are response or countermeasure portions to it, but it is primarily a prevention-based document. Much less emphasis on after-the-fact measures or reactive measures. I read through some SPCC plans, and it's like 80-90%, contingency plan, response plans, they miss the boat. It's mostly about prevention and containment and procedures and training. It requires that regulated facilities both prepare a written SPCC plan and implement the SPCC plan. And the plan has to be site-specific. There's huge variation in the detail that a plan has and the way that it is written and the format and the clarity and the writing style and the level of detail again and what it references or what it refers to. Huge detail or huge variation. And again, it's site-specific. And the plan has to address three big primary areas. It has to address procedures, inspection procedures, operating procedures, and testing procedures. It also has to include certain administrative measures, such as training, record keeping, reporting requirements, etc., but an awful lot of procedural-based measures. Again, site-specific. The plan has to address secondary or other containment measures or other spill diversionary measures. Not everything requires containment. And even the containment that's required, there's a fair amount of variation in what that containment has to achieve or what type of containment can be used. And other control measures like valve positioning, type of valves, procedures for discharging accumulated liquids in containment. And there's some countermeasures and cleanup measure requirements that need to be in a plan. So the plan has to address those various requirements, and that's what a huge part of the SPCC rule addresses is, okay, here's what the requirements are. Starting to keep in mind that these requirements are somewhat engineering based, but by and large they are performance oriented. Its containment has to be sufficient. Procedures have to be adequate. Inspections have to be routine or frequent. What does that mean? Well, there's no definition or no criteria for what that means. It is by and large performance oriented, which makes it a challenge to inspect. And we'll talk much more about that as we go through the rest of the program. And again, it's performance oriented, somewhat engineering based. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's just sort of a quick heads up of what an SPCC plan is. And it's not just writing the plan. There are, as we're going to get into, there are rule-based requirements. There's a whole bunch of rule-based requirements. The rule, 40 CFR 112, requires certain things that the facility has to comply with. In addition, the facility has to write the SPCC plan to say what? How they are complying with those rule-based requirements at that facility. And then what does the facility have to do? They have to implement their plan. So they have to comply with the rule. They have to write a plan describing how they're complying with the rule. And they have to do what their plan says. A facility could be completely in compliance with the rule and completely in compliance with the plan portion of the rule, but not be implementing their plan as written. Compliance issue? You betcha. The facility could have a plan that meets all the requirements. They could be implementing their plan exactly as stated, but they could be violating or operating contrary to a rule-based requirement. Right? So that's also a challenge for inspections, and that's sort of a misnomer in some of the, when you read through APSA, because when you read through APSA, does it kind of imply that physically what are you going to be inspecting? Tanks. Look at all the tanks or a representative sampling of tanks. All right. And then what are you going to be reviewing? Do they have an SPCC plan? There's a lot more to it than that. You're looking at not just the tanks, you're looking at the areas, at procedures, at records, at training, at the facility's understanding what it is their plan says they're doing. You're looking at tanks and containers and piping and handling areas and transfer areas and loading areas. You're not just looking at the tanks to meet the intent of APSA and to meet the requirements of what facilities have to do under the rules. So just keep that in mind as well. It's more than just the plan. It's more than just a tank. There's much more to it than that. That's one of the reasons why we spent 3 days, going through some of the stuff. All right, a little bit about the history. And again, the federal rule has been around since early 70s. It's an old rule. EPA, again, relies very heavily on the reviewing and certifying engineer to write these plans. Initially, the federal rule, I don't want to say it was primarily intended for, but largely looking at these larger oil handling facilities. Refineries, oil production facilities, cargo terminals, marine terminals, large manufacturing facilities, chemical manufacturing facilities that had oil, larger manufacturing facilities, even though in reading through the rule, it did apply to the medium and smaller size facilities as well. But when you look at a lot of the requirements in the engineering-based control, and some of the interpretations, it tended to look like it focused on the bigger facilities. And because of that, some of the questions on capture and interpretation could probably stand a bit of refreshing. For example, how long can a cargo truck with So, again, keep in mind, this program has been around for a lot of years. EPA tried to amend it over the years, and they amended it to some extent. There was only a major rule amendment that applies to us in the APSA world in 2002, and a couple of amendments since. But because of the 2002 amendment, the resulting lawsuits, and the various other rule amendments and extensions, the SPCC program and the APSA program is in a huge state of flux right now. And inspectors need to be aware of that and aware of some of the changes. That's why the recent history is fairly important. The older history is important just to recognize what EPA was thinking in terms of writing the rule and why it's so subjective. Because EPA is relying on the reviewing and certifying engineer to make these determinations according to good engineering practice, even though a lot of the requirements in the plan are essentially procedural and administrative based and really don't have a lot to do with engineering. EPA still relies very heavily on that, and back when these rules were initially written, every single SPCC plan had to be reviewed and certified by a professional engineer. It's only been since the December 2006 amendments that EPA has allowed certain facilities to prepare an SPCC plan without it being reviewed and certified by a professional engineer. So that's, again, changing somewhat. Quick bit of history. The rule promulgated December 73 was effective in January 74. There were a couple of minor tweaks in the 70s, primarily tweaking some of the federal rule enforcement. There were a couple of big amendments in 1994 and 2000, primarily impacting larger oil handling facilities that posed a substantial harm of releasing oil into waterway. And those were passed as the result of several large front-page news-making spills, including the Ashland oil spill, I think 800-some-odd thousand gallons of heavy fuel oil, or heavy heating oil, washed over the containment berm from a catastrophic tank release, got into, I think, the Ohio River. I forget which river. I think it was the Ohio River, the Monongahela River. Got into the river and contaminated drinking water sources for miles downstream. It was a result of that EPA passed, that Congress passed the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, OPA 90, that EPA then required, developed rules and required certain larger facilities to prepare and implement what are called facility response plans. We'll talk a little bit about those in a little bit. It's not really what you're going to be inspecting under APSA. EPA would like you to look at one or two particular things on there should you be at one of these facilities. We'll talk about it. But that was 94 and 2000. But 3 times since the mid-90s, EPA was looking at amending the SPCC rule, and they tried and they issued drafts or proposed regulations, but they never finalized everything. And it wasn't until July of 2002 that EPA promulgated its first major revision to the federal SPCC rule. A bunch of people sued EPA right after that thing was promulgated. Various industry groups, various other entities, including the Petroleum Marketers Association of America, a number of other groups. And they claimed, look, EPA didn't interpret things right. There were loose interpretations. Things could be misconstrued. Some things EPA said were going to be regulated that they felt the intent was not to regulate those. Certain things that people felt EPA didn't listen to sufficient public comment, and what they were requiring folks to do or clarifying that folks had to do was not possible to do. So a number of people filed lawsuits against EPA. What did that do? It delayed the effective date of the implementation, much like in California, right? There's a proposed regulation. The regulation comes out, particularly federally, sometimes in the state. There is a certain time lag between when the rule is promulgated, when the rule is published in the Federal Register, and it becomes effective. Typically, federally, there's a certain amount of time. EPA delayed that effective date to give them time to address the lawsuits. I don't want to say EPA lost the lawsuits, but they settled pretty much all of them. They settled the lawsuits, and they published the lawsuit settlements and the settlement agreements in the Federal Register to sort of memorialize them and make them, much more publicly known, and to sort of officially capture them, saying, yes, we will change the regulations. All of that stuff is on your CD under the general US EPA folder. There's some information in there. There's some examples of those. I think I have all the original Federal Registers in there as well. I have a copy of EPA's internal training, or EPA's training materials on the 2002 amendments on your CD. So that delayed it, right? May 2004, they settled the lawsuits. They published the settlement agreements in the Federal Register. They delayed the effective date. A lot of the settlement agreements, even though they were published in the Federal Register, they had to be put into the form of regulation. So EPA amended the federal rule in December of 2006, capturing in most but not all of the settlement agreement issues, of the lawsuit settlement issues, along with a couple of other things, right? Again, further delaying the effective date. In May 2007, there was yet another rule extension. In other words, including the 2002 amendment. What if somebody had a plan already in place before 2002? Because of the delay in the effective date, right, the delay in the effective compliance date, none of these facilities had to amend their plan to comply with the new rule requirements until after the effective date, or until that effective date. So a lot of folks amended their plans just because I thought, why not do it now? A lot of folks did not. A lot of folks did some, but not all. And that's fine, because the effective date had not yet in. And here we are in 2007 already, right? Another delay. EPA then, and in the middle of all this, EPA is putting out information. They're collecting information. In December 2008, EPA further amended the rule, completing the rest of the settlement agreements and allowing for other, based on some of their information collected. For the most part, the 2006 amendments and the 2008 amendments, by and large, added flexibility to the compliance requirements. There were some new requirements added in, as we're going to go through. For example, new engineering certification requirements that kicked in 2002, various other requirements in 2002. But the 06 and 08 amendments primarily added flexibility, which would change the flavor of some plans and the detail in some plans and the approach that some facilities take. But again, EPA delayed the effective rule. Now, what was happening right around, December 2008, November 2008? Change in federal administration. And this has been going on for 20, 25 years. What happens every time some new administration comes in? What do? They stop all of the regulations that were recently issued. Like, oh, hold on, 60-day hold. Let's just see what those rat bastards did in the last administration, right? Every administration does this, right? 60-day hold on the regulations just to see if they pass new administration muster, right? So that kind of threw a wrench in the works. And in the middle of all this, EPA said, okay, well, we're going to make we're going to extend the effective date, and they changed the effective date. It went out to, I think it was February, right when a memo came out from the White House saying, nope, you need to pull this back, and it went out, and then it got pulled back. EPA at the time had a July 1st, 2009 effective date for all of the rules, the 2002 amendments, the 2006 amendments, the 2008 amendments. EPA said, okay, everything, people need to update and amend their plans to incorporate all the requirements by July 1st of 2009. All right? But right around the time when all this stuff was going on, we're writing this class, back in February, March, and April of this year. And at the time, it was July 1st of 2009. Well, so we're start teaching a number of these classes. It wasn't until sort of towards the end of June of this year that EPA published yet another rule extension saying, you know what? Instead of July 1st, 2009, now, unless something changes, the 2002 amendments, 2006 amendments, 2008 amendments, folks do not have to amend or update their plans until when? November 10th, 2010. All right? That's where we're at. And even still, the December 2008 rule amendment, EPA still says is effective January 14th, 2010. Well, what all this means is if people want to amend their plans and if they want to amend their program to meet all of the more restrictive, relaxed, more flexible requirements, they can. They can do it whenever they want. When do they have to? November 10th, 2010. One of the changes that the December 2008 amendments kicked in, how many of you guys have heard of qualified facilities? A couple of people. How about Tier 1 qualified facilities? All right, EPA in the 2006 amendments, EPA said, you know what? There's a bunch of these smaller guys out there, these smaller facilities that really don't pose a big risk. As we're going to get into in Module E, probably first thing tomorrow morning. They said, okay, you're going to have these facilities that have, let's say, less than 10,000 gallons of oil capacity, right? Typically in double-walled steel tanks, these typical lube cubes, EconoVault, Safe Waste, Convaults, Enviro stores, containment solutions, all these different brand secondary containment tanks. They don't really pose a big risk. All right, so we're going to let these guys prepare an SPCC plan, but we're not going to require a PE review and certification, right? That is a qualified facility, and we'll talk about the specifics a little bit later on. That's a qualified facility. Those rules were in the December 2006 amendments, which if somebody wants to take advantage of them now, they can because they exist in the regulations. They don't have to until November 10th, 2010. All right. In the December 2008 rule amendments, EPA said, you know, there's an even smaller group of these qualified facilities that their biggest tank is only 5,000 gallons, right? These guys are really small. We're going to make it really easy on these guys, and we're going to put together an SPCC plan template. And I'll pass this thing around tomorrow. We have an SPCC plan template, and they can use the template to complete their plan. We'll talk about template issues when we get to it, right? And that's fine. But those December chokes me up. The December 2008 rule amendments do not become official, i.e. they are not going to be published in the regulations until when? January 14th, 2010. Now, why EPA didn't pick one date, who knows? But let's say you have a facility right now that wants to be a Tier 1 template facility, and they go to the federal regs to get a copy of the template. Can they do it? No, they can't. It's not going to be published until January 14th, 2010. Now, for exam purposes, look, it's November 10th, 2010 is when all this stuff's going to be effective, right? When we first put this course together, we were assuming, silly us, that all this was going to be effective by the time we taught the class. Frankly, even that November 10th date originally was April 1st, 2009. All the stuff was supposed to have been passed and effective by now, but that didn't happen. But and the state requirement, basically because you comply with the feds, these were all federal changes. This had nothing to do with the state. These were all federal rule compliance day changes. So the materials that we're training on, the handouts that we have are assuming that all of the compliance dates have passed, just to make it easy on you inspectors. I mean, it's hard enough trying to learn one version of this rather than a couple, right? So when you take a look and when you go through your ECFR, your Electronic Code of Federal Regulation handout, we printed this thing. I'm trying to see if we even have a date on this thing. We printed this thing actually back in April of 2009. This printed version is essentially the version that will be in effect after January 14th, 2010, and you may want to make a note on here. There's it talks about the January 14th compliance date, that's fine, but it also mentions throughout the rule a July 1st, 2009 date. That is now November 10th, 2010. So just make a note on the front of this thing. It's not July 1st, 2009. It is November 10th, 2010. That is the new roll-up effective compliance date. And I say that because some people in class will go to the ECFR, they'll go to the internet, and they will try and print out their own copy of the rules. Because they don't like our copy of the rules, they will go print out their own. And every one of them comes to us and they say, well, you know, the rule that I printed out, it's different than what you handed out. You're talking about Tier 1 facilities, and I don't see Tier 1 facilities in the copy of the rule that I printed out. Well, of course not, because it's not going to be in there until January 14th, 2010, right? This is what will ascend, unless EPA changes it again, and who knows if that'll happen. The handout here, this is what you will be inspecting to, essentially, after November 10th, 2010. So that just explains some of the dates. And I know it's confusing, but hey, look, that's, you know, EPA kept changing the dates, and that's what it is. Is there a possibility the federal rule will change before November 10th, 2010? Never say never, as we have learned. Now, as we go through the rest of this class, when we talk about the specific requirements, we'll talk about this is a 2006 amendment. This is a 2008 amendment. Because when you review some plans, you know, you may notice some differences in the plan than what we talk about, and that would just explain that that's an artifact of some of the rule change. Some of the changes are little minor, little wording changes. You know, they just kind of change the nuance a little bit. But again, you know, if you're going to be inspecting to a fair amount of detail, you'll need to know that. Some people are. Some agencies will. Other agencies are just going to look, do they have a plan? Does it look reasonably good? Does the place look clean? That's all I'm going to look at. If that's what your agency is going to decide to do, that's what your agency is going to decide to do. And a lot of this detail that we're talking about is moot, but at least you've had the background. So you will see this table. I think we even have this as a handout. All right? And this just kind of summarizes it, right? Now, let's say, what if there's a facility that didn't actually become operational, that wasn't even built until after 2002, and they become subject to APSA? When do they have to prepare and implement an SPCC plan? November 10th, 2010. Right? It's all, now, how many in your agencies, if you know, how many of you guys are planning on starting your APSA facility and tank facility inspections, Thursday after 4:30, 4:45 or so? After you've passed your test, you have your certificate suitable for framing, right? You have that in one hand, you have your badge in the other. You're holding your inspection checklist in your teeth. How many of you guys in your agencies are planning on inspecting this year? All right, how many of you guys are planning on inspecting sometime next year, but before November? All right, how about after November, or you just don't know, right? Number of people. None of this is to say that you cannot conduct APSA inspections. You certainly can. It's just going to be a challenge for you. You will be able to look at, do they have a plan? Do they need a plan? Are they implementing their plan? Regardless if they've amended or updated their plan to meet the new rule requirements, regardless of whether they've done that. Everybody who needs a plan now, if they were in operation on or before August of 2002, they need to maintain their existing plan. They don't have to update it. They don't have to amend it to meet the new rule requirements till November 10th, 2010, but they still have to maintain and implement their current plan, which means they need to do what they say they're doing in the plan, right? They still have to meet all the requirements that they've summarized in the plan. And for the most part, the vast majority of the requirements are still in effect. They still have to have sized containment for their bulk storage containers. They still have to have general containment. We're going to explain what that is. They still have to have general containment for all of their other oil handling areas and oil-filled equipment and piping, etc. They still have to train their people in the same information. The plan still has to have an engineering certification. They still have to have sufficient facility security. They still have to have written procedures for inspections and testing. They still have to conduct integrity testing as described in the plan, right? They still have to keep the plan current in terms of any changes at the facility, any new tanks, equipment operations that impact the risk of a release. So they still have to keep their plan current with regard to what's happening at the facility. They still have to do all that. So you're talking maybe 85, 90, 95% of what you're going to be inspecting is still in effect, will not be changed by any of these rule amendments. Some of them will. And we'll talk about specifically what is new. That way, when you see an existing facility, you read their existing plan, some of the compliance requirements will be different after November 10th. All right? So we'll talk about that. Or they may relax some of the requirements. EPA says they can take advantage of the more relaxed requirements, but they will need to they should amend their plan as a result, but they don't have to until November 10th, 2010. So there will be some inspection challenges for some folks. Yeah.
Did applicability change significantly through any of these amendments?
Did applicability change significantly, or did applicability change with these amendments? Applicability was clarified. In particular, 2002 amendments and the 2006 amendments and some elements of the 2008 amendments clarified that it is not just the storage of oil that is regulated, it is the use, handling, processing of oil, which means people who had oil-filled electrical equipment, oil-filled mechanical or oil-filled operational equipment, oil-filled manufacturing equipment, hydraulic systems. That stuff was always intended to be included in the SPCC rule. There were an awful lot of folks out there who interpreted the old pre-2002 regs to just be storage. We used to see SPCC plans that didn't include manufacturing equipment, operational equipment, or electrical equipment because it said these don't store oil. They use oil, and that's not what EPA regulates. That was not true. That was how they interpreted. EPA clarified that, oh no, it does include all this, by the way. Which is one issue where you may see some old plans that don't include that, and they need to. That's one of the reasons why plans need to be updated and amended by 2012, or by 2011, right? Wind generation systems, wind turbines are in. And we will see a stark example of that sometime in Module D. All right, so that's kind of the issue. So what if a facility is, what if they just start becoming subject to the rule? They have 1,320 gallons of petroleum after November 10th, 2010. When do they have to have a plan in place? Before they start operations, right? So you have a flat piece of ground, November 15th, 2010. They bring in a 2,000-gallon above-ground diesel tank. They bring in the tank. They set the tank in place. As soon as they connect the piping, they need an SPCC plan in place, even before they fill the tank. Why? What's regulated? Is it the volume or is it the capacity? It's capacity. So they can't build it, fill it up, and say, okay, we have 6 months to get a plan in. No. They have to have a plan in place before they start operation. Right? So take a look at this chart here. Yes?
Quick question about the second line. It sounds like you don't need to have anything at all in terms of an SPCC plan until November, as long as you went into business after August of 2002.
I don't know. Let's go through it, shall we? All right. So let's say you have a manufacturing facility. I don't know. They're building widgets, whatever the heck they're building. And they started their manufacturing operation in August 1974. But it wasn't until January of 2004 that they began increasing their petroleum oil, and all they have is petroleum. Make it simple. All they have is petroleum oil. No vegetable oil, no synthetic oil, no whale oil, none of that, just petroleum oil, right? And in January 2004, they started increasing their petroleum oil storage and use capacity and usage capacities, and they became subject to the federal SPCC rule and APSA in June of 2004. That's when they kicked over 1,320 gallons of capacity. All right? So in June 2004, surprisingly enough, they read the regulations and they read the statute, right? And they submitted their above-ground petroleum storage statement to the State Water Board in February 05 and March 07, because it was a biennial report. So they actually did that. They paid their fees. Surprisingly, they complied with the original version of APSA. All right? So here's the question. Federally and under APSA, when is or was this facility required to prepare and implement an SPCC plan? Okay, so federally, what's the date? November 10th, 2010. Why? Let's go back. Why? Yeah, I mean, they were in operation well before 2002. But when did they become subject to the rule? When did they start SPCC regulated operation? June of 2004, right? So they began it. So they started becoming subject to the federal rule in June 2004. So now, when do they have to have a plan written and implemented by? November 10th, 2010, right? So how are you going? Well, okay, and then let's go through APSA. What about under APSA? When do they have to have a plan in place? Per Health and Safety Code 25270.4.5a. November 10th, 2010. Why? Prepared and implement in accordance with the federal rule. Now, here's a tricky question. When are or were these guys just subject to APSA? When did they become subject to APSA? June of 2004. So even though they don't have to prepare and implement a plan until November 10th, 2010, what are they potentially subject to right now? Notification or tank facility statement or business plan submission, and fees if your agency is going to be, developing the fee, the fee structure. Yeah. Yeah. So how do you know? I mean, how are you going to know? When how do you know? You go to this facility. How do you know that this facility even exists? How do you know any of your regulated facilities exist? Yeah, maybe you've driven by there. I mean, what program do you think maybe they've been in all this time? Business plan, right? Their disclosure program. What else? Maybe fire code. Maybe hazardous waste. Maybe underground tank. Whatever. They may be in one or more of your other programs, so you know they're there, right? So for those agencies that may be doing APSA inspections before November 10th, 2010, and you show up to this facility, you say, hi, here's my badge. May I please come in? And they usher you in and give you a lovely cup of coffee and thank you. I'll drink that later. And you say, do you have an SPCC plan? And they, huh? They look at you like you just landed from Neptune. They don't have, or they go, I don't have an SPCC plan. Are they in violation? They don't need a plan until November 10th, 2010. But how do you know that? Yeah, no, I told you. Look, I'm a consultant. Don't ever believe me. Number one, I'm Steve Lichten. Don't believe what I say. Number two, I'm a consultant. Really don't believe what I say. And I'm wearing an Aloha shirt, for God's sakes. All right? How do you know these dates? You're going to be asking. Perhaps they're under a permit. Not everybody who's regulated under fire code actually complies with the fire code, obviously. Maybe they don't have building permits. How do you know that they have this stuff there? Maybe you go back to look at can I take a look at your business plan or your inventories? But which version are you going to have to go back and look to see when did they actually start storing or using this kind of capacity? You're going to have to go back to the 2004 records, if you have it or if they have it, to really decide, unless you want to just believe them. Some facilities don't have those records. You may not have those records. Also, what if most of this capacity is in the operational equipment? An operating oil-filled manufacturing equipment and oil-filled operational equipment is regulated under the rule. In your experience, does everybody who have hazardous materials in an inherent part of the operating equipment inventory that? No. I think they should. I'm sure many agencies think they should. But a lot of people interpret the hazardous material business plan and inventory as what? Storage. Here's my drums. Here's my containers. And a lot of people don't inventory stuff that's otherwise regulated and captured. So, these are challenges to you. There's no easy answer. But these are challenges to you if you're going to be inspecting under APSA before November 10th, 2010. Now, if you're going to be looking after November 10th, 2010, does it matter to you when they began operation? No, they need a plan. Regardless of what they put on their business plan in inventory, because you're going to be verifying that they have X amount of oils of petroleum capacity in this captured equipment. So again, just keep that in mind. And your agencies may decide, look, you're only going to go to the place that they've had to have a plan all these years. Or maybe these guys even just wrote a plan. Then they do have a plan, and that makes life easy, even though they really didn't need one until November of next year. That may happen too. All right, a little more further review of the rule. We're going to see this chart a couple of other places. Now, the 40 CFR rule runs 40 CFR, Title 40, Code of the Federal Regulations, 112.1 through 112.15 or so. Then it skips over to 112.20. And real quick, just a quick note. And of course, for SPCC purposes, we're talking about after November 10th, 2010. How many of you guys ever have need to look at the Code of Federal Regulations? Right. How do you guys do it? What physically do you look at? How many guys have nice little CFR, printed CFRs in your bookshelves? Right. The day you get that from the government printing office, it's out of date. Actually, the day that they print it, it's out of date. Right? Does everybody go online to look at the CFR? All right. There's two ways to look at the Code of Federal Regulations online. First of all, how often is the federal regulations updated? Every day in the Federal Register. Every single day. Maybe not what applies to you, but, right? And it's the government printing office sort of collects all those once a year to publish the hardbound CFR book with a set of CFR books, right? But that's why they're out of date as soon as they're published. So you go look online. There's two places to look online. What's one of them? The eCFR, the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. The other way is, yet again, through the government printing office website, and you get both versions through there, which is simply the online PDF version of the out-of-date published bound Code of Federal Regulations. If it's a PDF version, 2 columns, it looks like the bound CFR, it's out of date. What you want to do is look at the eCFR, the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. This thing is updated every day. So if you want to go look for 40 CFR 112.6, you can go to the eCFR website. If you don't know what it is, just Google eCFR and it'll tell you. And the version that you get is the version that's correct, updated, in effect that day. The only caution I give you with the federal SPCC rule is, remember, it's going to be different after July 14th of 2010. That's all. So, what I did, I printed this out, back before they yanked the December 2008 amendments offline. But you usually want to go to the eCFR because that'll give you the most up-to-date requirements. So, all right, let's just finish up going through this as they're setting up lunch back there. So, you're going to find a couple of different parts. Now, as it relates to APSA, Subpart A, 40 CFR 112.1 through 112.7 are SPCC rules that essentially apply to everybody who's regulated under the SPCC rule. Doesn't matter what kind of oil, doesn't matter what kind of facility. 112.1 through 112.7 applies to everybody. The only caveat, which we'll hit in a second, are the qualified facilities, those smaller facilities. There's a little tweak there in 112.6, which we'll go through. But essentially, 112.1 through 112.7 apply to everybody. 112.8 specifically is worded requirements for onshore non-production facilities. Onshore non-production facilities. What does that mean? That means onshore, not these offshore platforms. Non-production facilities means non-crude oil production facilities. I added petroleum oils because we're here in APSA land and we only care about petroleum under APSA. And I added non-oil production just to help clarify it a little bit, right, which we'll explain. But that's 112.8. 112.9 through 112.12, and there will be a couple of others, apply to oil production, crude oil production facilities, oil drilling facilities, oil well workover facilities, offshore platforms, vegetable oil, animal oil, kernel oil, nut oil, fruit oil, mammal oil, all kinds of non-petroleums. Because it's non-petroleum, we don't care under APSA. That's why we don't really pay attention much to that. Subpart D, 40 CFR 112.20. These are the requirements for facility response plans. Now, what a facility response plan is, these are, has anybody seen an FRP, a facility response plan? These are big, fat, thick, heavy-duty oil spill response plans. How do you deploy the booms on the ocean, right? What are all the sensitive habitats all up and down the coast or all up and down the river? How are you going to deploy your helicopters to disperse the oil spill dispersants? I mean, extraordinarily detailed response plans for oil spills into the water. These plans are required by those facilities that pose a substantial harm of getting a lot of oil into the waterway. We're talking big facilities, millions of gallons of storage, transferring a lot of oil to and from vessels over water, refineries, offshore platforms, bulk petroleum plants, marine cargo terminals, for example. big facilities. Now, you're not going to be, because the APSA rule says SPCC plan, you prepare and implement an SPCC plan in accordance with 40 CFR 112. It does not refer to the facility response plan, therefore it's not part of your APSA inspection, with one exception and one favor. The one exception is that pretty much every SPCC facility has to do an evaluation of whether they pose a substantial harm. If they do, they have to prepare and implement one of these facility response plans. If they don't, they don't. But all of them have to keep that one-page certification of substantial harm in their plans. On Thursday, I will show you an example of that form. It could be filled out by a facility in about 3 minutes. It does not have to be engineer certified, just signed by management, and they just need to do it once. It is extraordinarily simple to do. Everybody uses essentially the same template to do it. You just want to see, is that one-page sheet of paper there? If it's not, tell them to do it. Maybe and we'll talk about it on Thursday. Maybe provide an example form up on your website. Now, what EPA would request of you, as we go through this form, when we go through that form, it'll take 2 seconds. If anybody checks yes to one of the harm criteria, then they need one of these facility response plans. All EPA asks is that you look at the plan to see if they submitted it to EPA or Coast Guard for review and approval. And we'll go through that on Thursday. That also should take you about 10 seconds to do. And EPA just wants to know about it. That's it. But pretty much everything else is 112.1 through 112.8. We are going to go through this in more detail, probably middle of the day tomorrow. But just as a quick heads up, there are various elements, obviously, in the rule. 112.1, general applicability. Who does the rule apply to? It talks about substantial harm of an oil spill risk, etc. 112.2, EPA does a much, much better job of defining terms than does APSA. All those are in 112.2. 112.3, the basic requirement criteria for people to prepare and implement an SPCC plan and requirements for engineering certification. 112.4 is basically where EPA can require a facility to submit the plan to EPA. It's not normally required, but that's where EPA can require submission of a plan. That's where EPA can require somebody to amend their plan. 112.5 is when a facility itself is required to review and otherwise amend or update their plan. 112.6 are the specific allowances for these smaller qualified facilities. Not going to be applicable to everybody. And we'll talk about who a qualified facility is when we get to it tomorrow morning. 112.7 are basic SPCC plan requirements and many facility compliance requirements that apply to every SPCC and APSA regulated facility out there. 112.8 are more specific requirements that apply to specific types of facilities and pieces of equipment, i.e. bulk tanks. We're going to spend a lot of time talking in a lot of detail about requirements specifically under point 3, point 5, point 7, and point 8. We're going to spend a lot of our time talking about that. All right, let's check a couple of things in the rule. Now, there are 2 things that I want to hit up front in talking about the federal SPCC rule that you just need to be aware of. One of them is a definition. Not a definition. One of them is a reference. Now, we kind of talked about this before lunch. We talked about this morning. What's one of the big primary goals of the SPCC rule? To keep oil out of the navigable waterway, right? To keep oil out of waters of the United States. In a lot of different sections and subsections of the federal rule, particularly in 112.7 112.3, 112.8. As part of their performance standards, you will see wording and you'll see things that say stuff like to prevent, secondary containment has to be sufficiently impervious, to hold oil long enough to prevent a discharge as described in section 112.1b. Inspections have to be conducted frequently enough to prevent a discharge as described in 112.1b. You're going to see a number of different sections that will use that terminology. Discharges as described in 112.1b. So let's take a look at 40 CFR 112.1b, and let's see exactly what the heck it is they're talking about. I don't know, it's in 112 somewhere. 112.1b in your federal rule. 112.1b, when it talks about general applicability. It says stuff like, except as provided in paragraph D, this part applies to any owner or operator of a non-transportation related onshore or offshore facility engaged in drilling, producing, gathering, storing, processing, refining, transferring, distributing, using, or consuming oil and oil products, which due to its location could reasonably be expected to discharge oil in quantities that may be harmful as described in Part 120 of this chapter into or upon the navigable waters of the United States or adjoining shorelines, or into or upon the waters of the contiguous zone, or in connection with activities under United States, Magnuson, Anyway, what does that mean? Bottom line, what does that mean? Don't spill your oil, right? Right. That may be harmful as described. What is a harmful quantity of oil? Essentially, that which could cause a sheen upon the water, or deposit a sludge, or an emulsion in the water, or upon a shoreline. That's really what this means. Enough oil to cause a sheen upon the water, cause an emulsion, deposit a sludge upon the shoreline. That's really what all that wording means, right? A discharge of oil to the surface of the ground where it soaks into the soils is not a discharge as described in 112.1b, unless that ground surface is essentially the shoreline of a river or a waterway. That's pretty much what that means. It is not the California definition of harmful. It's not harm to property, safety, health, or the environment. This is deposit a sludge upon the shoreline, an emulsion, or a sheen upon the water.
So if it is discharged over the ground, and then rainwater washes it
into the storm, that could be a discharge to navigable waters. That could be a discharge in harmful quantities to waters of the United States, if it goes off-site, if it goes into the municipal storm system. But just that spill sitting there does not. If it sits there and then the rain comes off, it's when that rain washes it off. So that's part of the performance standard. How much oil does it take to create a sheen? Yeah, pretty much about a drop. Doesn't take a lot of oil. So it's a fairly small reportable quantity on the one hand, but on the other hand, it has to get to a regulated location first, i.e. storm drain, municipal storm drain, off-site is typically how it's interpreted. If it stays on site, if it stays in containment, if it stays on the facility property and does not go off, that is not a discharge as described in 112.1b. Now, it could be reportable under California release reporting rules if it poses a harm to safety or a threat to property, but it's not a federal discharge to waters of the United States. And that's an important consideration in terms of the performance-oriented nature of the federal rule. And we will see various examples of that. But, where you see, describe it, to permit a discharge as described in 112.1b, i.e. discharge to navigable waters. All right. And the regulated navigable water with regard to, let's say, municipal stormwater systems, municipal stormwater systems, where is that point? When it hits the storm drain. Doesn't have to make it to the ocean. Once it hits the storm drain, that goes off-site.
That would be a public storm drain, or would it be an on-site?
If it retains it on site, it is generally not a water of the United States. but you kind of get into some weird, wacko legal determinations there. For example, and this is just a quick example. What if the facility's on-site stormwater system is designed to take all the rainwater and stormwater that falls on the property and channel it to an on-site holding pond? That holding pond, in certain cases, may be considered a water of the United States, depending on some legal interpretations, kind of beyond the scope of this class. Maybe, but generally, if it stays on the property, it is not going to be considered a water of the United States for the most part for our purposes. Okay. So, and if, as a hobby, if you're interested in navigable waters, knock yourself out. On your CD, under the first US EPA reference folder, I have a whole separate subfolder of oodles of stuff on navigable waters, including recent the Rapano Supreme Court decision, some of the Federal Circuit Court and Court of Appeals determinations of navigable waters of the United States, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer navigable water guidance and determination document, all kinds of stuff on navigable waters. Knock yourself out. Generally not applicable here in California. I also have the State Water Board's General Counsel memo from 1995, I think, saying that all of California is a navigable watershed. So, pretty much any storm system in California is a navigable water. That memo's on there as well. All right. The next subsection that I want to hit right now to help kind of get us through the rest of this. Have you guys been, heard any of this APSA talk that, in class we talk about, you don't have to be a registered professional engineer to inspect in this program. But because mainly if you're not a registered professional engineer, you're not going to be making any engineering determinations or judgments as part of your inspections. Because this is an engineering-based, performance-oriented rule, there are things that the facility may say that they're going to implement, or they say is adequate, that is essentially an engineering judgment call. What if you disagree with that? What if the facility says, we have sized containment for the volume in this tank, and we think that 1 inch of freeboard is adequate for rainfall? And the facility says, and the engineer says, yep, that's okay. What if you think that's a bunch of hooey? Get a third party to review. And it says that in the plan, and it's an engineer certified plan. If that plan is engineer reviewed and certified, that's the engineering determination. And to question it, you're basically making an engineering determination. You would be practicing engineering. And only a professional engineer can practice engineering. And you risk certain civil liability if you practice engineering without a license. Yes, you can probably get a third party. You can go get yourself a PE and challenge that, but it's still opinion versus opinion. And that's part of the unsatisfying nature for doing APSA inspections of SPCC plans. There may be things in the plan that you don't like how it's written. You don't like what it says. You don't agree with the approach. Maybe the facility is describing how they are going to contain a general release and keep it out of the storm drain by spill control equipment and response actions. And they've never had a spill, but they're not drilling and training on it. Their plan doesn't say that they are. They just say, here's what we're going to do. And you don't think there's any chance on this planet they will be able to implement what they say they will. But there is no evidence that they've ever tried it or that it's ever failed. You just don't think they'd ever be able to do it. Are you able to really find a compliance issue? You're not. That's an engineering determination. And that's very unsatisfying. Now, I'll talk about how EPA addresses that in just a second, but yes, sir.
Well, couldn't you use another applicable code like a storage code that requires security?
If you're doing an APSA inspection, what code are you looking at? APSA statute as referenced with the EPA. Now, if you want to say, look, fire code says something different, that's fine if you're going to do a fire code inspection. And maybe you're doing a combined inspection. But that doesn't mean it has to be in the SPCC plan, because that's a different code that's applicable outside of APSA. All right. Another, yeah.
It doesn't take an engineering credential to see mathematics right. You know, you can calculate freeboard and storage capacity pretty easily.
Well, capacity you can, but freeboard is up to engineering judgment, as we're going to talk about. Yeah, well, it's freeboard is whatever's adequate. Pardon me?
I said I disagree with you with all this.
Okay. Well, freeboard just has to be adequate, and it's up to the engineer to determine adequacy. All right, but we'll get to, I'm just starting to use an example of an approach. We'll talk about the details later on. Why would EPA write a rule that's so generic, that's so general, that's so roughly performance-oriented, and leaves it up to anybody who writes a plan and certifies a plan? Why would they do that?
I just want to get a little bit of clarification. Are you saying because the PE is stamping and signing the plan, that pretty much everything in there is covered by?
Not everything in there. Some things. But remember, the SPCC rule, what he's saying is, just because, is what I'm saying, because a professional engineer is stamping the plan or certifying the plan, does that imply that everything in the plan is adequate? No. There are huge implementation issues. Also, there are certain things that are they're not performance oriented, they're specified requirements. Engineers stamped or not. They're specified requirements like capacity of secondary containment for the volume of the largest container. That's one thing. That's using a measuring stick and a calculator, right? That's not necessarily engineering. But there are many, many other things that are performance oriented that we will be talking about. Things like sufficiently, how impervious does containment have to be? How much oil does it have to keep back from soaking through? The frequency of inspections, the type of integrity testing, and the frequency of those. Subjective. It's as adequate for that facility as determined by a professional engineer. And then the facility just has to do what they say, or do what's said in the plan. We'll talk about those specific issues. But how does EPA get around the question of, well, an engineer said it or an engineer certified it? EPA doesn't have most of these problems. We do in APSA because we don't have the same authority. Take a look at 112.4D. 40 CFR 112.4D. This is essentially how EPA gets around those issues. Now, we started talking about, remember when we were talking about spill reporting under 250.270.28? Now we mentioned, there are some EPA requirements that if a facility spills enough oil into the waters of the United States, they have to call EPA's regional administrator, report themselves, and maybe send a copy of the SPCC plan up to EPA to review. That specific requirement is in 112.4. And if you look through most of 112.4, it'll say things like if you're the owner of a facility, whenever you've had, over certain discharges, you have to provide within 60 days certain information to the regional administrator, right? Then under 112.4b, it says take no action, until it applies to your facility. So until that trigger hits, you don't have to worry about it. But once the spill trigger hits, then 112.4 kicks in, right? And then 112.4c says, in addition to the information that you send to the EPA, you have to send a copy of that information to the state, i.e. to you guys, the Unified Program Agency, right? So they have to send it to that, you have to send it to that facility. Or the facility has to send it to the state agency, which is basically a copy of what they've sent to US EPA. All right, that's fine, right? And it says upon receipt of that information, the state agency or you guys, the Unified Program Agency, you can review it, and some of that information may be a copy of the plan, which again is only required to be submitted if they've had this kind of spill. They don't have to submit it ahead of time, right? So you, the Unified Program Agency, may review the plan and say, yeah, what, I'm doing a plan review based on what they've sent to us, and we think this is terrible. We think they didn't do enough. We think this is written poorly. We think the facility needs to go further. Pursuant to 112.4C, who do you tell that to? You tell that to the EPA regional administrator. Hey, I'm adding my 2 cents. Here's what we think about the plan, right? You don't send it to the facility. You send it to EPA, okay? And then, what is 112.4D? What does that require a facility do? Amend their plan if after review by EPA's regional administrator of the stuff that they've submitted or the stuff that they've submitted to EPA by you, the state. Again, if after review by EPA. And then what's that little 5 or 6 words there in the second line up from the bottom? Amend your plan if after review, yada, 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 da, 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 paragraph C, or after on-site review of your plan, the regional administrator requires that you do so. There is no similar provision in APSA. If EPA does a compliance, an SPCC inspection of the facility, if EPA is saying, you know, I know the engineer certified the plan, and I know the engineer said 1 inch of rainfall freeboard is adequate, we don't agree with that. EPA says, look, I know the professional engineer certified the plan and certified that this type of general active secondary containment using spill equipment is adequate for this facility. Based on our inspections and in talking with the people who have to use it, how much is here, the fact that they've never drilled and trained on it, and the fact that everybody has said, hey, they're going to run towards the big end of the windsock, they're going to protect themselves, right? Engineering judgment aside, we, EPA, we're going to require the facility amend their plan because we don't think this provides sufficient protection. 112.4D is what gives US EPA the authority to do that. There is no similar authority under APSA. All you can do is pass determination on part of your inspection. Did they prepare and implement an SPCC plan in accordance with the rule? This doesn't kick in until EPA tells them it does. That's the problem. So you may not like how a plan is written, but there's no hard and fast compliance issue with it. We're going to talk about some ways of conducting the inspection and perhaps some interactions with the facility and what you can say to them perhaps that will help send the message that it would really be best for them if they reevaluated those particular items. But even though they're not necessarily black and white compliance issues, without making an engineering determination, because we in California don't have this ability to just say, look, you know, we think your plan's insufficient, we don't think it's protective enough, so we're going to require you to change it. Because there are going to be many things that you may not like, but they're not necessarily compliance problems. Hence, as I say, the dissatisfying nature of APSA inspections in some cases. Yes, sir?
But this only kicks in after they've had those spills, right?
Mostly, but remember how this thing is worded, 112.4D. Amend your plan after on-site review of your plan. EPA's got an awful lot of flexibility. So, if and when you take a look at EPA's regional inspector guidance on your CD, or whatever new version's coming out next year, and if you were to take a look at a lot of EPA's own inspector training materials, a lot of that detail is focused on judging the quality of somebody's protective measures. You know, how do you determine whether you, the EPA inspector, should feel that this is adequate or not, to help them with that 112.4D determination, which we here in the APSA world aren't necessarily going to be making. Now, you could read it, you can think about it, you can talk to them about it, but we will see specific examples of where it may not be a hard and fast compliance issue. They may not be in compliance. If they try and implement it and it fails, that's another issue. No, but just as a quick heads up, that's 112.4. And a lot of issues that we're going to talk about in class where it's like, look, you know, what if this is what they say? You know, this is the level of detail. Do you guys think that's good? And a lot of you are going to say, I don't really like it. Does it meet the compliance requirements? Yeah, but I don't like it. That's 112.4. If EPA doesn't like it, they can make them change it. If we don't like it, you maybe make some suggestions, but that's pretty much the extent. Or refer it to EPA. But keep in mind, how many EPA regional inspectors are there in Region 9, which is California, Arizona, Nevada, Hawaii, Guam, and the rest of the Pacific Southwest. 2 to 2.5 to 1.5 to 3, depending on temporary assignments and all that, but there's basically 2. They're not getting to everybody. And they can't answer every question. And they can't address every little, every small implementation issue. So we'll see more examples of that, but I just wanted to kind of, sort of introduce that 112.4D issue, because that's what makes EPA's life a lot easier in many cases. All right, there's a couple of appendices. Appendix C is that substantial harm criteria. We're going to see that example substantial harm certification on Thursday. All that wording that's in there in that page that I'm going to show you comes out of Appendix C. That's why it's pretty easy to make a template. Appendix G you will not see officially until after January 14th of 2010. That is the template SPCC plan that Tier 1 qualified facilities can use, and we will talk about who a Tier 1 qualified facility is tomorrow morning. So we're going to do that. So that's it for just a quick, brief introduction to Module C.